WBUR Podcasts, Boston.
I'm Daryl C. Murphy, and you're listening to The Common. Andrew Brinker, welcome back.
Thanks for having me again.
Oh, yeah. So, just to remind folks, you are a Boston Globe business correspondent, and you specifically focus on housing, correct?
That is correct, yes.
Excellent. So guess why we have you back?
Oh, you want to talk about housing again?
Oh, yeah, had to, man. Andrew, last week, State Attorney General Andrea Campbell announced that Massachusetts cities and towns must comply with the state's new MBTA Communities law. Before we get into that, can you give us a brief summary of this law?
Sure. So MBTA Communities is pretty broadly thought of as the biggest housing reform Massachusetts has seen in a good number of decades. Essentially what the law is saying is it's honing in on this idea of transit-oriented housing development. It identifies 177 communities in eastern Massachusetts that either have direct access to the MBTA or are adjacent to a town that has access to the MBTA, and saying, we're not going to tell you where, but somewhere within a short radius around that train station, you have to change your zoning to multifamily zoning that allows for apartment complexes, that sort of thing, quote unquote, by right. So without having to seek a special permit. So it's this really broad law that is essentially trying to undo some of the zoning that hasn't been in place, that is maybe preventing the kind of sustainable housing development that we want to see in the state, specifically around these transit stations.
Got it. Well, with all that said, just how helpful could this law be in solving the state's housing crisis?
Yeah, it could actually be huge for the state's housing goals. And what MBTA Communities would do is, since it's asking for a minimum zoning capacity of X number of units in every town, if every single town follows the law, implements this new zoning, that would mean that the state now has the capacity for more than 200,000 new multifamily housing units, new apartments, new duplexes, so on and so forth. I mean, and that's huge. It could have a significant impact on the state's push to build more housing and to dig out of the shortage that we find ourselves in.
All right. Now, I understand some cities and towns have not been complying. Why is that?
I mean, there are a whole host of reasons that some of the cities and towns that are either openly not complying or that are thinking about it have given for not wanting to do so. Concerns about infrastructure to simply just don't want the new housing in their town. And I think that is sort of the pervasive attitude among residents and local officials that are maybe considering not going along. The reality is that a lot of these cities and towns wrote their zoning codes that are either almost entirely still intact or that have been changed very, very minimally, something like 40 or 50 years ago, when zoning rules were really being drafted as a tool for racial and class exclusion. And those zoning rules were also drafted in those days with this idea of the quote unquote American dream in mind, the suburb of single family homes where, you walk out your front door and wave to your neighbors. That is just not really super realistic anymore, given the kind of housing shortage that we have.
Well, yeah. How legitimate are the concerns of these places that are pushing back?
I understand some of the concerns, and generally speaking, zoning is a fairly ambitious task, especially a zoning reform of this size. But there are only, I think, 12 communities that have to have it done by the end of this year. And then there's a new set that will have to have it done by the end of 2024, and then a new set by 2025. So there's a couple years built in there for the most part that communities have. I think the state's idea here is that, look, these communities haven't done any new rezoning for sometimes 50 years, 40 years. If they're not going to do it, we're going to have to make them do it because, it's clear that they're not going to make these changes on their own and buy into this regional, statewide goal of digging out of the housing shortage.
We're going to take a quick break, but we'll be right back.
Politics has never been stranger or more online, which is why the politics team at Wired is making a new show, Wired Politics Lab. It's all about how to navigate the endless stream of news and information and what to look out for. Each week on the show, we'll dig into far-right platforms, AI chatbots, influencer campaigns, and so much more. Wired Politics Lab launches Thursday, April 11th. Follow the show wherever you get your podcasts.
And we're back. Well, Andrew, last week, State Attorney General Andrea Campbell made an announcement that cities and towns must comply with the MBTA Communities law. What does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, it sends a very strong signal to these cities and towns that are maybe considering testing their luck and seeing what happens if they don't comply. For towns that are not in compliance right now, they already received a letter from this advocacy group called Lawyers for Civil Rights. And that letter essentially said, go along with the zoning or we are going to sue you. I talked to a couple of the local officials in some of those towns, and they were kind of saying things along the lines of bring it on. You know, we're not going to be deterred by an advocacy group. But having the Attorney General come out and say, not only can advocacy groups sue you, but the state can sue you as well. You know, it's a strong message. And there was at least one community that had been considering not going along. Holden, I was talking to I believe it was their town manager the other day, immediately after this advisory came out. And he said something along the lines of, you know, we believe pretty strongly in this, but it all comes down to how much money this ends up costing and how strong our political will is. Think about a lawsuit from the state and you're a very small town and your resources are limited. Yeah. I don't know how long you're going to be able to retain an attorney to fight that battle for you.
Right. Well, that's a lawsuit, right?
Yeah.
Are there any other ways the state can enforce this law?
Yeah, there are a few other mechanisms. Up until this point, the state essentially tried to design this law to focus on what we would call quote unquote carrots, and now a lawsuit being the quote unquote stick. The carrots are essentially a couple of different grant programs that focus on improving infrastructure in towns. So there's MassWorks, which gives some towns a fairly decent amount of funding. You just apply for the program if you need to, you know, fix a road or something along those lines. And some towns have relied on that funding and others have not. And then there is also Housing Choice, which is essentially fairly similar, except towns only get those grants when they have done zoning work or housing work that the state deems good. So there's those two programs. And then there's this third carrot kind of stick. It's a little bit in between. There was this third program, the Local Capital Projects Fund, which initially was used as funding for these other infrastructure grant programs. But the legislature reallocated that program. And so what it now does is fund the budget of housing authorities. And so what's happening is that in towns that are choosing not to go along, now they also risk losing funding for their housing authorities. So that's another thing that they really need to consider.
Well, I wonder if any of that will work to incentivize these municipalities. Is it a situation where some of the wealthier places will just say, well, we don't really need the money because our tax base will float us, you know, our tax base will get us through?
It's very possible. I mean, that's something I've heard a lot. Waltham is one town I can think of that has been having very, very serious conversations about defying the law. And the only reason that they're in compliance right now, at least how it has been relayed to me, is because they weren't aware that their housing authority money was going to be affected. And once they heard about that, they pretty quickly filled out the forms and met the compliance standards so they could maintain that funding. But Generally speaking, yes, that is a sentiment that is fairly pervasive, specifically in wealthy communities, or there are frankly just towns that don't take money from these infrastructure programs. So in that sense, the carrots aren't necessarily effective. And in wealthier communities, yeah, they probably have the money to say, well, we'll just fund this ourselves. I've seen emails where some residents have offered to make up the gap in the housing authority money that theoretically they would lose for not going along. The attitude of, defiance against the law is still fairly prevalent, but I imagine the Attorney General's guidance will be fairly dissuading.
Okay, well, this is the situation in Massachusetts. I wonder how effective are these kinds of laws in other places?
It's a great question, and unfortunately, there aren't really any examples that I can point you to because Massachusetts is kind of a leader on this front, actually. This law really is a first-of-its-kind attempt.
Wow. So is it safe to say that there's a lot riding on this legislation because if it works, it will set an example for other states?
That's a really good point. There are a number of states that are really trying to get out in front of, or not, I shouldn't say get out in front of because they are behind the housing problem, but that are trying to get out in front of the game on housing solutions. California comes to mind as a state that has, pared back zoning restrictions. Oregon, and now New York is going along as well, modeling a law specifically for housing development in the suburbs of New York off of Massachusetts law. It has a few more teeth, I should say, than Massachusetts law. MBTA Communities is really interesting because, Massachusetts is traditionally a really, really strong town state. Housing choices have always been left up to local communities. And I'm saying it's interesting because, in a place like California, the governor has come out swinging on getting towns to pare back their zoning restrictions, essentially saying, if you don't do it, the state's going to do it for you. Massachusetts isn't doing that. They are saying, we really respect the importance of local zoning control. So we're saying, we need you to do the zoning that allows for new multifamily housing, but you do it yourselves. You decide where and how you want your community to grow. So they're trying to walk this really delicate balance between making this new zoning happen and simultaneously not pulling too much away from the towns, so much so that it becomes a really, really fiery political issue.
Well, Andrew, we could spend all day on this. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us, man. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
That's Boston Globe business correspondent Andrew Brinker. And that's our show for today. Thank you so much for listening to The Common. If you have any thoughts on housing, please hit us up on Instagram, Twitter, or TikTok at WBUR The Common. You can also send us an email at thecommon@wbur.org. I'm Daryl C. Murphy, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.